Well, welcome everybody. I'm so proud and privileged to introduce Professor Olivette Otele to deliver our 60th Founders Memorial Lecture at Girton College. Olivette is a world-renowned historian and distinguished research professor of the Legacies and Memory of Slavery at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. She's actually the first Black woman to be appointed to a professorial chair, amazingly, in history in the UK. So that's quite an extraordinary achievement and slightly depressing, I have to say, at the same time. For more than 2 decades, she's investigated the ways in which Britain and France have been addressing questions of citizenship, race, and identity through the politics of memory. She also inquires into the value of public gestures, the meaning of public history, and the impact of cultural memory. In recent years, Professor Otele has studied the concept of restorative justice in relation to legacies of enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade, using both legal and political frameworks. And she advises policymakers and institutions engaging with legacies of enslavement to help shape their strategies in this incredibly tricky field. She was previously Professor of the History of Slavery at Bristol University and Chair of Bristol's Race Equality Commission, where she undertook a 2-year research project on the university and the wider city's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Clearly not work for the faint-hearted. Must be an incredibly resilient person. She's a fellow and former vice president of the Royal Historical Society. And her recent publications include the award-winning book, African Europeans, An Untold History. It was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for Political Writing. And it was named as a top book of 2020 by The Guardian, not just The Guardian, also by Foreign Affairs and by History Today. And if that weren't enough, she regularly contributes to the press, to radio, to television, and she's a consultant for films and documentaries. I'm going to name a couple here, which jumped off the page to me. African Queens on Netflix and Chevalier now on Disney+. So it's a huge honor to welcome Professor Otele to Girton College tonight. And we're going to hear her deliver the 60th Founders Memorial Lecture on Europe and America, engaging with transatlantic enslavement, memories, legacies, and restorative justice. And there will be a short opportunity for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to take a moment to enjoy this. My grandmother would be so proud. Yes, she would be. Now, I would like to start by thanking you all for being here tonight and Girton College for inviting me and for nominating me for this talk. Dr. Elizabeth Candle, thank you so much for your warm welcome, and your team as well. You've all been wonderful. Girton's mission and core values really align with mine and resonates because it started out from what I read as a dedication to the education of women, and it resonates with me because education changed my life, and I have to therefore pay homage to this college and to the forefathers too, but foremothers who made it what it is today. It's really, really an honor. I mean it. Now, on to my presentation. I chose this image, which is cotton, because I won't have time to kind of delve into the hard bits of history related to the history of cotton. But we have to bear this in mind. As human beings across this planet, we tend to mark what is deemed important through celebrations, commemorations, anniversaries, and so on. Historians talk about sites or realms of memory that are constructed, curated, sometimes, a lot of times, for political aims, or remember to reconstruct part of a past that is supposed to unite us. We remember to produce a kind of knowledge that we deem relevant for the present and for the future. Those acts of remembrance are never perfect and can be source of trauma for parts of society we live in, especially if they exclude, trigger, devalue. I would like this presentation to be part of a remembrance process that doesn't glorify or exclude, even though it is focused on the so-called conquerors of a trade called transatlantic slave trade. It is a trade, as you know, that set Europe, America, especially North America, on the path towards incredible wealth, a kind of wealth that led to investment in science, banking, health, education, and so on. A wealth that, for instance, allowed merchants in Bristol to invest and provide clean water, hospitals, train station, education for a few to start with. So, I also want us to understand that the cost was a displacement of millions of people from the African continent. Human beings, captives coming from various places, with no common languages, thrown together, made to work in plantations in the so-called Americas. Let us look at what it means practically. So I'm not going to delve into numbers, but I just wanted to throw this at you because while I'm talking, us historians, in order to prove that we're completely serious about our trade, we are supposed to stand back and look at this coldly. But it's very hard to do that when this history is a source of trauma for parts of humanity. What I want people to grasp is that the numbers, however, still matter. So you have a few dates here, but I'm going to give you a bit more context. I chose this slide and I called it human trafficking. Now, I know it's purposeful. I know that the trade was legal, allegedly at the time, but it was still trafficking because the law changed across time and centuries and depending on which part of the world, which places in Caribbean islands. So sometimes it was actually illegal to buy and other times it was legal. So, but in terms of looking at it from the kind of restorative justice viewpoint, we mostly use the term human trafficking because it has various ramifications. Now, when we talk about restorative justice, it is about commemorating. I know it sounds unusual, but it is really about commemorating, remembering, repairing the damage of the past, bearing in mind that it is a task that can never fully be successful. But reparations are about the legacies of that past and their impact on the communities whose ancestors were forcibly removed from the African continent. So this talk will focus on Europe, America, even though the question of reparations cannot be envisaged entirely if the African continent is not part of it. So today, it's more about what Europe and the US have been grappling with and how. I just need to come back to talk about the African continent. It deserves a whole lecture. Now, I want you to just look at this. This is the Atlantic trade in 2 minutes, and this is the number of people who were forcibly removed from their lands. It is about the number games, it is about dehumanization, but this is also about people, some dying on the west coast of Africa, others surviving the Middle Passage across the ocean. Surviving, not necessarily thriving, but giving birth to new culture, to a history of resilience and activism and survival and beauty. The ugly reality of plantation life is that a lot of them died, but those who survive are there, some in this room, to tell the story. And I just wanted you to appreciate that for a few minutes. The years of the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment. The money that came from human trafficking, that allowed technical innovation, art, poetry, science. But it's also about agency of this population, fighting, collaborating, surviving, building bridges, plotting, strategizing. Now, if you look at the numbers on the slave trade database, you will find out that Portugal and Spain are coming on top. And then you have Britain, France, the US, and the Nordic countries. It's basically the whole of Europe involved in that trade. I don't have many slides. Actually, this is the last one, because I want to move on to why I'm here. So all over North America and Europe, universities, private companies, churches, and other organizations are or have been investigating their historical connections to slavery. Some of these institutions once owned plantations or enslaved people. Others were established or maintained through donations from slave owners or their descendants. When an institution uncovers such histories, a question arises. When I say uncovers, quite often that work has been prompted by activists, educators, parishioners, and so on. People from within, from outside. Again, there are tensions between the goodwill to address these issues, but also pressure to do so. So what are the questions that this implies? What should the institution do to address the wrongs of the past, wrongs with consequences that continue to be felt today? The question is part of a much larger debate. What does society owe the descendants of enslaved and colonized people? How can we measure the harms caused by the slave trade, enslavement, and colonialism? When these harms span centuries and still shape our lives, who can decide what ought to be done to repair these harms, and who should pay? How does payment look like, and who should be the recipient of said payment? As a historian who specializes in the legacies and memory of slavery, these questions often land on my inbox, but also I teach students on the histories of the past and on the ways in which societies deal or don't deal with those questions and why such resistance to addressing them. I have also sat on dozens of meetings with board members in various institutions. These include the Scott Trust as an external advisor over the last few years. I was asked to give my opinion on their research and to provide responses. So the Scott Trust, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's a company that owns, I know it's grand, yes. It's the company that owns The Guardian, The Observer, and a few other major media company. And the idea of reparation, I must say, I understand is controversial for many people, especially in countries where either colorblindness or multiculturalism has been chosen as a model of integration of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. Britain and the US being examples where the notion of multiculturalism is key, whereas France, Denmark, Sweden are examples of countries that prefer a kind of colorblind approach when it comes to dealing with minority ethnic communities. France, for example, doesn't see race. And in the last few years, two presidents wanted to kind of remove the term race from the constitution. And incidentally, that was more of a political maneuver because actually within that constitution, there are provision about racial discrimination and gender discrimination. So the idea was we remove race, but we replace something, we add something about gender discrimination as if both, couldn't go together. But what is interesting is that in the case of multiculturalism or colorblindness, the models fail to acknowledge that centuries of racial inequality have produced the stark social and economic inequalities of the present. Reparations, by contrast, start with this acknowledgement. The term restorative justice, which I use interchangeably, some might argue that no, but I do. I use it with reparation, is usually associated with a legal system as a method of dealing with crime. In such a context, restorative justice prioritizes repairing the harms suffered by the victim of an offense over punishing the perpetrator. It also seeks to understand the issues that caused the offense to happen. It means going back to that history and that story. So restorative justice is about a dialogue between the so-called victim and perpetrator. It is about a community of people coming together to address an issue and to work on a strategy to repair together. And I insist, together. When it comes to addressing the harms of slavery and colonialism, the general public often finds restorative justice a more palatable term than reparations. Perhaps the latter seems coldly transactional, nothing more than a transfer of cash, whereas restorative justice implies collaboration and healing. It's of course a misunderstanding. But whichever term they use, groups that advocate for reparations almost never seek only money. Their work is grounded in an understanding that the social, the political, the economic are bound up together and must be addressed together. Calls for reparations emerge from belief in healing, the possibility of a better world. It is never about us and them, but always about a plight, a conversation, to recognize the past, its harm and impact on many people's lives today. And I see it as a way of working towards a form of reconciliation with all that it implies. It's a battle, it's a fight, but it's, you fight within the home, the same family. These calls have grown louder since 2020. The killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery in the US, followed by Black Lives Matter protests across the world, highlighted how often Black people are deemed dangerous and disposable, and how often the justice system fails them. Discussions about schools and university curricula have revealed that certain aspects of the past are persistently obscured. Both the inhumanity of colonial regimes and the long-standing and valuable contribution of minority ethnic communities. The Rhodes Must Fall movement, which began in South African universities before spreading to Oxford and around the world, is, I might argue, to some extent about reparations, since it demands a re-examination of the past. Debates about reparations are both urgent and long-standing. Enslaved people have been demanding reparations since the 15th century, not long after European colonial enslavement began. From the story of Juliana, enslaved servant working for Elau Burgos in Amsterdam, to Ursula, working for Frances Marcus in Valencia, both mentioned in my book, African European, both demanding forms of compensation. We know that enslaved people, either in plantations or in wealthy houses across Europe, have fought for forms of reparations from the very beginning. We even have examples of the King of Congo demanding that the Pope did something to prevent European colonists from taking and selling his people. One of the earliest cases of reparations in the United States, though reparation was not the term that was used, dates back to 1783, when Massachusetts ordered that formerly enslaved woman Belinda Royale should receive a pension from the proceeds of her enslaved estate in acknowledgement of her unpaid labor. In the 19th century, Britain and France voted that those who needed reparations were not former enslaved, but the owners of the enslaved. So following the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, British plantation owners were granted compensation for the injury of having their property, so-called property, their enslaved people, taken from them. It is known as the 1837 Compensation Bill. At the heart of demands for reparations is the understanding that the past cannot be erased and must not be ignored. Former colonial powers cannot undo the damage they inflicted on enslaved and colonized people, but they can engage in good faith dialogue with the descendants of those people and work to address the systemic racism and inequality that exists today. Now, yet, 21st century European and North American governments have resisted discussions about reparations. When they do take steps to address present-day inequalities and racism, they do so without explicitly connecting these problems to the legacies of slavery and empire. And so it is left to the individual institution to decide whether to investigate their histories and what kind of reparations might be appropriate. In the absence of government support or directives, the efforts of these institutions, which are often beholden to shareholders, donors, or alumni, are inevitably partial and sometimes constrained. I'm going to give you a few examples that are not necessarily related to university just yet. Greene King, for example, which today operates more than 2,500 pubs, restaurants, and hotels across Britain, was founded by Benjamin Greene in 1799. Some years later, Greene became the owner of several plantations in the Caribbean and a vigorous supporter of slavery. In the 1830s, he received compensation from the British government for having owned 225 enslaved people. Almost 2 centuries later, in the summer of 2020, Greene King publicly acknowledged this history. The company announced a new partnership with Liverpool's International Slavery Museum and the continuation of its diversity work with the Prince's Trust. It promised to fund Black History Month initiatives, create opportunities for young people from Black and minority ethnic communities, and to develop a diversity strategy. End of January this year, we learned that the bosses of Greene King were going to meet officials in Yves and St. Kitts to discuss reparations in the form of investment in education. We will probably hear more in the coming months. Greene King's announcement in 2020 came months after the murder of George Floyd. On both sides of the Atlantic, demands to address centuries of racism were loud and heartfelt, but these demands were not new. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a leading American civil rights group, had been calling for reparations from the US government for decades. The Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe was established in 2001, and there are many other organizations that have been demanding reparations. Some of the calls for reparations have focused on the financial industry. Many banks born before the 19th century had close connections with the slave trade, funding plantation owners or merchants who invested in the slave voyage. In 2004, a group of descendants of enslaved people filed a lawsuit against the insurance market Lloyd's of London for financing the ship that transported their ancestors to North America. Lloyd's denied the claim, and it was dismissed the following year. 15 years later, on the same day that Greene King made its announcement, Lloyd's released a statement apologizing for its role in the slave trade. It pledged to work on increasing diversity among its employees through a more transparent and rigorous recruitment process. And in 2021, they appointed an archivist to research the company's involvement in slavery. In 2023, Lloyd's presented the result of a research that they commissioned, and that had been done by academics from Johns Hopkins and Brown universities in the US. You can read the findings online. So initially, the term reparations or restorative justice were absent from the announcement and promises made by Greene King and also by Lloyd's. Instead, both companies used the language of multiculturalism and diversity. Hiring more staff from Black and minority ethnic background was a priority, they said. The Royal Bank of Scotland and Barclays have similarly recognized the links of their links to slavery and stated their support for, quote, diversity and inclusion. But they did so without making any clear connection between the past and the low number of their employees from minority ethnic backgrounds. So making these connections is actually central to the work on reparation. Without them, we can never fully understand the consequences of slavery. It's not a pick and choose, diversity over slavery. They're linked. Some institutions have not progressed much beyond simply acknowledging the past. In 2020, the National Trust released a report into its buildings. You probably heard of this on the news. You know, it attracted a lot of noise. And the Bank of England, which owned enslaved people in several Caribbean plantations in the late 1700s, details this past in a current exhibition. So the Bank of England also has been doing some work there. The exhibition called Slavery and the Bank. Some of the material associated with the exhibition mentioned that descendants of enslaved people have called for reparations from the beginning. But there is no suggestion that the bank itself is going to invest substantially, and the term substantially is really depends on who's talking. So bringing the past to life seemed to be considered engagement enough for some institutions. A slightly better model, is offered by the Rowntree Society, an educational charity that researches the history of the Rowntree family and its companies and trust. In February 2020, the Society decided to study its connection to slavery, and I served as a consultant. And that's not why I'm saying slightly better, by the way. A little over a year later, the Society and its various trusts released a statement recognizing, quote, the lasting damage inflicted by the colonial global economy in countries where the Rowntree businesses operated. The Rowntree Society departed from the approach taken by many other institutions. It acknowledged that its action in the past continued to cause harm. And actually, I know that they're still working. I'm not a consultant there anymore, but they're working on ways to make it viable, because their commitment, they didn't want to see an end date to the commitment, so they need to work on their finances and so on and so forth. In North America, some of the first private institutions to consider reparations were, of course, universities, 100 of which have links to slavery. In 2003, Brown University's first Black president, Ruth Simons, commissioned an investigation into the university's connection to slavery. 3 years later, the report presented its findings and made a number of recommendations, for which included memorializing the past, creating a research center for the study of slavery, and providing support, financial and otherwise, and this is really important, to local communities negatively affected by Brown's past. Most of these recommendations were put into practice, but students and staff have continued to push Brown to do more, as well as to recognize that the university is located on stolen land from indigenous people. In 2021, undergraduates voted that Brown should give reparations to the descendants of enslaved people affiliated to the university. Again, it's ongoing, but a lot of things have been done there. Again, you can find these information online. In the last few years, many more American universities have studied their link to slavery. In April 2022, Harvard released a report representing 3 years of research. The university's president pledged $100 million to carry out the report's recommendation, which included building relationship with the descendants of enslaved people who labored within the university or were enslaved by Harvard associates. So while these universities are doing what they're doing, the political arena had also been involved in the US, quite differently from the UK, I must say. In July 2022, in the US, a bill was introduced in the House and Senate to set up a commission that would discuss the question of reparations. The reparations were aimed at addressing the legacies of enslavement, which are systemic racism, economic and racial discrimination against Black Americans. It was stated that an estimate to address the racial wealth gap would cost $14 trillion. In December 2023, the state of New York stated that it would set up a commission to look into the question of reparations. Prior to that, other states actually have been actively involved in the debate through various organizations. Just to give you an example, the National African American Reparation Commission's 10-point plan came up in 2015. So debates in the US have certainly been more advanced in some ways than in the UK. I must emphasize two things, though. The first one is that we have to bear in mind that the UK tended to have larger plantations, while the US had smaller scale plantations. Farmers had enslaved people living with them, while the UK had quite a number of absentee plantation owners. So that had an impact on the ways in which they view the question of slavery and certainly the question of reparations. Now, I've said that the US, the debate is more advanced than the UK, but the UK is actually, in their approach, more advanced than, let's say, France. And I won't say anymore, because there's nothing to say. In 2019, Glasgow University became the first British university to set up restorative justice scheme, pledging 20 million to build a research centre. They have done that in partnership with the University of West Indies for the study of public health and economic growth in the Caribbean. And the relationship between Caribbean and African countries, there's a lot to be done, but a lot is happening in Glasgow again. Following Glasgow's commitment, other universities began to examine their past. More than 3 years later, for example, the results of this initial enthusiasm are mixed. In 2019, I was appointed Professor of History at the University of Bristol, in part to lead the research into the university's connection with slavery. I left Bristol 2.5 years later. I'm not going to ditch the dirt. I'll just say that something else, the university is still grappling with a lot of questions, of justice, but a lot has been done by the city itself. It's actually extraordinary what's happening in the city of Bristol. Bristol adopted, through a multi-party plan, adopted a motion that was aimed at addressing and engaging with the question of reparation. Outstanding. A legacy foundation will be launched next month, and I'm part of it. But the Legacy Foundation comes after years of working with communities, grassroots organization in Bristol, to set up a restorative justice agenda and to see what it looks like. Of course, when you're doing this kind of work, it's not just grassroots in the council. You need also the work and the collaboration of churches, of merchant ventures, who some of them have come on board, and many other parties. So as I said, it has to be a dialogue. It's a very difficult dialogue, I won't lie. I mean, some of the meetings are interesting, but it has to happen. A more hopeful example lies in the University of Cambridge, woohoo's main report into its involvement with slavery, released in September 2022. Now, this report, for which I serve on the External Advisory Board, is the product of extremely rigorous research. Its recommendations are grouped into 4 themes. Most of you know, but I'm going to tell you still. Funding further research, memorialization, engaging with Black British communities, and developing links with universities in West Africa and the Caribbean. And the report recommendations are far less ambitious than Brown's or Harvard. Nevertheless, they leave open the door for further discussions and for engagement with communities around Cambridge and throughout Britain. And one of the things that when I looked at the website about Girton's involvement is the setting up of a working group. And I think that's really is the way to do, because each college has its own history, its own path and ways of doing things. What I would hope to see for Girton and other colleges engaging, not just within the university, but also outside with communities affected by that history too, is really important. Otherwise, we are often accused of living in a bubble at university level, so it really is time to spread out a bit more. Now, in 2001, how reparations might remedy the legacies of transatlantic enslavement was one of the key questions of the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, held in Durban. Even having the subject on the agenda was hugely controversial, and participating nations disagreed fiercely about the language of the declaration that was drafted at the conference. In the end, the declaration left each country to make up its own mind about whether to pursue reparation or not. I'm mentioning this because some countries haven't done much since then. Others have tried to find their own path, but there seemed to be a uniting voice as far as Europe is concerned that reparations are a big no-no. France declared slavery a crime against humanity and began a program of memorialization and education, which is incredibly important because the history of slavery is taught in France. Other countries led by Britain refused to issue formal apologies. The apologies came later. But the fear was that when you express an apology, then you have the legal obligation to pay reparations. And instead, regret was deemed a safer response. The European Union drafted a statement that expressed regret for the suffering caused by slavery and the slave trade. We all remember, perhaps not all, 2006, Tony Blair expressing deep sorrow for the slave trade. His statement included a call to, quote, rejoice at the different and better times we live in today. these words obscure the fact that though the times we live in today are indeed different, and in many ways better, they are still profoundly shaped by the existence of slavery, and I'm thinking about systemic racism. 2014, the Caribbean Community CARICOM, composed of 15 member states, put forward a 10-point reparation plan. Among other demands, this plan called for a formal apology from European government, a repatriation program for people of African descent in the Caribbean wishing to return to Africa, European investment in the Caribbean public health crisis, literacy program, and debt cancellation. Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, and other former colonial powers rejected the plan. In 2022, the Dutch government announced that the following month it would apologize for the nation's role in slavery and establish a fund of 200 million euros to raise awareness. There's a lot going on with that because some communities are saying that they have not been consulted, especially those living in the Dutch Guyana. And yeah, it's very contested. But it was a first for the Dutch government to do that. And I'm thinking about the fact that the Prime Minister made that commitment, but then he resigned. So we don't actually know what's going to happen to that pledge. It's very likely that it's not going to go further, at least for the next few years. In Nordic countries, the debates are not as virulent and engaged, but Denmark has shown some interest in engaging further with the question, very timidly, while Sweden and Norway remain silent. And for those of you who don't know more about the extent of Nordic engagement in the trade, well, okay, I'm inviting you to read my book. But you can also look at the slave trade database. It's online. It's incredible. It's fabulous. I would say that we cannot allow nations, and this is really a position that is personal to me. I think we cannot allow nations to leave the work of reparations to individual institutions. Having said that, I applaud individual institutions doing that work. At least they're doing that work. But what I mean by that is that institutions are dependent on several imperatives. The colleges are looking for funding for their own. Let's remember that the British Parliament was fully invested in the slave trade and transatlantic enslavement. The British need to step up and engage in that debate. I remember what Tony Blair said. I mentioned regret. Regret is not equal to apology, but when he expressed regret on behalf of the United Kingdom, he at least made it plain that if you live in the UK, your life has been shaped by the legacies of slavery. Even if you've never been to a Green King pub, visited a National Trust property, or invested in Barclays, your life has been shaped by the legacies of the past and the trickle effect and the ripple effect of the wealth that's coming from the slave trade, but also the legacies of the past as the ways in which our society view people of African descent. Anecdotal as it might seem, I was asking some of my students if they knew where the noises made in football stadium, the monkey noise that people make, were coming from. They didn't know, so I had to go back to 19th century scientific racism, Black people being seen as the missing link and all these stuff, and I traced back to today. It was interesting because we have the legacies of the past we don't even suspect. Now, I did mention the British Crown, and I should say a few words about this. Okay, I grew up in a republic, but it doesn't influence my opinion. A few years back, then Prince Charles, now King Charles, talked about the legacies of the past in so many ways. He actually has been in favor of opening the door to discussions about the past and to teaching Black history for many years. What he said a couple of years ago, I don't know if some of you followed, when he said it a couple of years ago that, we should teach Black history, I don't know if you remember the backlash and how, numerous newspapers, right-wing newspapers actually jumped at him. How dare he say that? Who does he think he is? Maybe the future king, I don't know. Anyway, what I would like to say now is that I think that the relationship between the Crown and enslaved people is not and enslavement is not a secret. It has been the object of numerous research, and from time to time we have articles coming online and saying that, oh, King Charles has links with the history of enslavement and so on and so forth. It's not really new history for some of us. What I would say, though, is that it is interesting to observe, because quite often the focus on the monarchy's involvement obscures the fact that a bigger number of families, a bigger number of companies were equally involved in that trade, and quite often resistance to talking about that past comes from them, as seen when the controversy of a former member of parliament threatening to sue Cambridge over the research on slavery recently. The question is, do those whose families were involved in enslavement and benefited from the work of unnamed enslaved people, subjugated bodies, women, men, and children, can morally claim that they are entitled to privacy? Should we grant them that privacy? Another question is the academic freedom and the limit of accessing archival material, especially for people of African descent. I cannot tell you how difficult it was for me to access some archives. An issue I had at Bristol, because I did my PhD in Bristol, as a PhD student trying to have access to material belonging to the merchant venturers. And as a fully fledged professor at the University of Bristol, trying to access material about the university's account in the 19th century, even though I was specifically hired to conduct that research. I was unsuccessful on both accounts, but luckily for the PhD, I actually had the National Archives and local archives, so yes. Some institutional effort seemed little more than a public relations exercise. Others simply repurposed the company's already existing anti-racism, pro-diversity strategy. One could argue that such corporate strategies can and should be part of reparations, but too often restorative justice agenda begin and end in the institution that developed them, with little consideration for the work that must be done in society as a whole. I'm going back to it has to reach out to the broader community around us. Controversies over how we should remember that past can paradoxically as well, and not everyone agrees with me with that, we can focus so much on the question of remembering the past, statues, and so on and so forth. And sometimes we forget the inequalities and discrimination that exist in the present. They are, of course, linked. But there are sometimes urgency that needs to be addressed: extreme poverty, discrimination, exclusion, mental health, marginalization. Quite frankly, young people of African descent are dying in so many ways, and mental health is a major one. We need to address that. Now, so who should address the question of reparation? I said institution, the state, etc. Those who have suffered most from the brutality of slavery and colonialism must be able to determine the restorative justice agenda. It sounds like a given, but it's not. This requires institutions to give up some control and power, something that many are unwilling to do. Even scholarly research into communities affected by slavery can be exploitative, with very few research grants in higher education allocating funds to the communities themselves. Instead, academics receive financial support to conduct research that uses knowledge produced by and stories from minority ethnic groups. It is exploitative. And I'm saying it as an academic, but also as somebody who sat for many years on HRC and all these committees where fantastic research was conducted, but you did not see any single person of African descent on the side of the academics. And communities did not, of course, have access to the funds allocated to the research. Restorative justice, which recognizes the agency of marginalized groups, is key to enabling people to lead decent life and dignified life. So I'm going to conclude. As the population of North America and many European countries become more diverse, as wealth inequality continues to grow, and climate change disproportionately affects the descendants of colonized people, we can expect calls for reparation to become increasingly loud. In June 2023, the Brattle report was published. It's a 116-page document that is the fruit of the work done by reparation experts, including all disciplines, including economists. And that looked at factors such as the cumulative wealth and GDP of nations that enslaved Africans over centuries, including interest they earned. It's worth reading. It's online. And it established that Britain owes 101 trillion pounds of reparation. So when the Church of England decides to pay X amount, individual families decide to pay Y amount without prior consultation or discussion with communities descendant of enslaved, it is perceived as farcical. As time goes by, we will also hear loud objections from those who benefited from the status quo and who cannot imagine a different world. But it is only through confronting the past that we can reimagine the future. It sounds like a cliche, but it actually is true. It is only through restorative justice that this new future can take shape. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. What a wonderful lecture. I wanted to ask, how significant do you think it was to have a conscious Black political leader in Bristol that drove the transformative change?
Listen, I live across the bridge in Wales, and what Marvin Rees has done in Bristol is, I can't even find the word. It's extraordinary, and extraordinary doesn't even begin to describe it. He's been on all fronts for many things. He's been looking at inequality, police brutality, everything. He's a child of Bristol. He knows the city from inside out. And he's also been able to kind of have a dialogue with those who so far resisted any discussion about, enslavement and social justice and reparations. And so he managed to get the merchant ventures on board, which is not a small feat at all. And I found it absolutely extraordinary. And I have to say, I'm sad to see him go, but that's his second term, and that's the end of it. So a leader of African descent, it's not just Black facing higher places, it actually has a meaning, because young people, of course, can see themselves in those roles. But he understands, he's of dual heritage, by the way, he understands the meaning of engaging in the political arena that has direct impact on communities. Yeah, I get really emotional because the Bristol Legacy Foundation was born because of him. The History Commission, after the fall of the Colston statue, was born because of his impulse and his commitment to that. There are other things that have been happening in Bristol, and I can talk about that city for ages, but I see the city as the forefront, as a leading example to really follow. If you want to learn more how to do it, you have to look at Bristol. Sorry, I'll stop gushing now.
Thank you so much for what I found a very moving address, if I may. I think you make it very clear that there's a sense in which there can be no closure to what is happening. Yet at the same time, the ideas of reparation and restoration suggest one could come up with some kind of equation that would create a closure. And I wonder if you had thought or wondered where our vocabulary might go. We actually don't. We both need the measurements and we don't need them, I think is what I'm saying. And I thought your talk was so provoking in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is not easy to kind of combine the hard facts, the figures, and the emotional content. When I said that it can never be fully repaired because we can't bring back people from the dead, and the suffering cannot be erased, but we can't listen, the world is burning right now, and we can't keep on letting our planet go that way. We need to find a way. That way it implies hard discussions, a bit of drama, tears, anger, but we need to come to a term because we have pressing issues. And when I say the world is burning, there's the climate emergency. There are things that are happening that we will need to address. But if we don't even come together about the past, how are we going to do that? So I think it's an emergency. So the language is difficult. It really is, because it's triggering. And I don't know if you noticed, I used enslaved, to try and see if some of you felt strongly about one or the other, or some of you are used to the term slave, but we know that it's actually triggering for many people. But anyway, we can have a whole discussion about language as well.
In line with the theme of restorative justice, there have been moves to sort of recover or restore Black voices in history, like untold stories. And so in the present day, by focusing on the role of institutions and the legacies of those enslavement, there continues to be a sort of a prioritization of the elite narrative or the enforcers of slavery. So my question is, do you think that that's a limitation to the narrative of slavery? And if so, what are the solutions or remedies?
Yes. I'd say yes, because we have to remember that the question of restorative justice and reparations started from the activist viewpoint. They're the ones who brought this question to the table, made enough noise for institutions to take over. Well, the institutions have taken completely over. But it cannot happen without that, from that bottom up. I don't like that term, but bottom up. And what I found really interesting is that it's really difficult for institutions to deal with that, because the challenge is too great for them in many ways. But I also see it as part of how we build a collective memory is through fight. And I'm very much in favor of that. That's why I keep repeating that we need to expand this conversation outside. Ideally, it would have been amazing to have people from a grassroots organization. It would have probably disrupted the whole talk, but this is what it is about. I'm hopeful though, because there seem to be, we have this world, this conversation here, but other conversations are happening elsewhere. So it's not just one pocket of resistance here and there, it's across the board. So I think that multiple conversation will bring up, the whole debate to a next level, I hope.
I just wanted to thank you very much for an excellent, very informative lecture. I'm slightly depressed that I'm not thinking that this is going to be a topic in the general election this year. I'm just sort of wondering what the steps are to get this properly on the political agenda. Might a new Labour leader remember what Tony Blair said in 2006? I've no idea. I think he might fear that it might stop him winning the election to talk about it too much, which is a bit depressing. But I mean, I was wondering, I'd be interested in your views on the way forward as to how you get this up the agenda. And I suppose education must be one thing and incremental steps must be another, but I'd be interested in your views.
Well, thank you. That's a really, really interesting point, because actually there are a few MPs who have taken on this question. Bell has taken that. Clive Lewis as well. There are a couple of others MPs, Labour MPs, but it's not yet the overmajority of MPs who are talking about it. A few of them wanted to be part of the agenda, and I'm not sure how strongly they'd be able to succeed. Yes, do you want to say a few words, because I would really.
Thank you. I can answer some of that, not least because of 30 years political activism. That interestingly, the Black churches, as never before, have become politicized. They call it the awakening of the Black vote, and they've made a manifesto, and part of the manifesto is restorative justice. And in just over a week's time, we're going to be hosting Reverend Al Sharpton and the Black churches, and telling the political parties, if you want the Black vote, engage with black communities. So I think for us, it's about not asking for justice, but politically demanding it. And we use your research and we use your articulation and empower communities to do likewise.
You have your answer.
Could I thank you for giving us the privilege of hearing your viewpoint? And could I just go back to Professor Strathern's question as to whether there's any new vocabulary? You've put up reparations and reconciliation. I wondered if there could be any progress made if we were to establish the values on either side that were involved in this process of reparation and reconciliation. And I have in mind that in legal circles from which I come, much progress has been made by using the word Ubuntu.
Oh, yes.
And you may be able to describe it better than me.
No, go on.
No, it's very simple philosophy. I exist because you are, and vice versa. It's this idea of coexistence and debt to others that could be used as the basis of a conversation or might stimulate some thoughts and philosophy.
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much, because I'm a historian in the Department of Law. Don't ask, don't ask. And we have these conversations where it's like minds coming together, and these are people who are working on various aspects of restorative justice, but they're quite reluctant to use the term restorative justice or reparation in so many ways, and it's fascinating. I just wish that it would transpire to the general public, because the general public is barely grappling already with the term reparation, and so the next step, I don't know how long it's going to take, but I'm really impatient. Thank you so much.
So always a sign of an amazing talk is overrunning dreadfully with the questions, because everyone's got so much they want to engage with. This was such a spectacular evening for us. And I do want to say that this isn't the kind of thing that we want to host at Girton and then all just go off and have a drink and a dinner and forget about it. I mean, you've left a deep impression on us. These are things that we were thinking about, and you've given us huge amounts to continue thinking about. I love those questions about the future. Where is this going? How are we going to fix things? Where are we taking it? What does tomorrow look like? And this is not just about history. This is about the future. And you really brought that home to us. So will you join me in thanking Professor Otele? Yes.